Okay, so you've sent us a ton on this fascinating but kind of scary world of person-to-person diseases.
Yeah, bacterial and viral, the whole shebang.
And we're diving into chapter 31, right? Which really breaks down how these things spread.
It does, like how these microscopic invaders, they get around. We'll be looking at airborne transmission
Direct contact to.
and even sexually transmitted infections. A lot to unpack.
And your sources, wow, they really go in depth, like how these bacteria and viruses, they're almost ingenious in how they've evolved.
Totally. To find new hosts. I mean, think about it. It's a microbial jungle out there, and we're right in the middle of it.
Makes you think twice about shaking hands, huh? But seriously, our goal is to break down what's essential, right?
Exactly how these diseases work, how they spread, how to treat them, and of course, how to prevent them.
And we'll try to do it in a way that makes sense, without overloading anyone, but maybe with a few surprises along the way.
Sound good.
So, first up, airborne stuff, bacterial diseases floating in the air.
And it's not just a few, it's a big problem.
Huge, globally acute respiratory infections, millions of lives lost every year.
Especially in developing countries where resources are often limited and the most vulnerable, young children and the elderly, they're hit the hardest.
Yeah, the chapter really emphasizes that how age plays a role and the fact that these respiratory infections, they're the most common human diseases, period.
It's a reminder, that we're constantly interacting with this invisible world of microbes.
We think of air as being clean, but it's not sterile, not even close.
No, not at all. And these bacteria, they've evolved some incredible ways to travel from person to person.
Like sneezing, right?
Oh yeah, a classic example, your sources mention how a sneeze can expel droplets at over 220 miles per hour.
Wow. It's faster than most cars on the highway.
It is, and each sneeze can carry millions of bacteria.
So it's like a microbial explosion going everywhere.
It is, and then there's coughing, even just talking, breathing, all contributing to this spread through the air.
And it's not just breathing those droplets in directly. Some of these bacteria can survive on surfaces.
Oh, absolutely, that's where fomites come in. Contaminated objects, think doorknobs, phones, things like that.
And your sources talk about how certain types of bacteria are tougher, like gram-positive bacteria with their thick cell walls and mycobacteria with their waxy layers,
Yeah, those guys are resistant to drying out, so they can linger for a while.
waiting for their next victim.
In a way, yeah, bridging the gap between infected people.
And then our respiratory system itself is like a battlefield.
It is a kind of microbial filter, divided into the upper and lower regions.
So the bigger particles get caught in the upper part,
Right, think the common cold, usually a pretty mild upper respiratory infection.
but the smaller particles, less than 3 micrometers, those can go deeper,
Much deeper, all the way down into the bronchioles, and that's where things can get serious.
like pneumonia.
Exactly, a
Yeah.
lower respiratory infection that could be life-threatening, especially for those with weaker immune systems.
And your sources also mention secondary infections?
Yeah, that's when one infection weakens you, and then you get hit with another, even worse one.
Like, say, someone gets the flu and then they develop bacterial pneumonia on top of that.
Exactly. It's a 1-2 punch that can be really dangerous, particularly for the elderly.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these airborne bacterial bad guys, starting with Streptococcus pyogenes.
Now, that's a name that sounds like trouble.
It does, but it's surprisingly common.
It is. Lots of healthy adults carry it in their upper respiratory tract without even knowing it.
But when it takes hold, it can cause strep throat.
Oh, yeah. And anyone who's had it knows it's no picnic.
No, it's miserable sore throat, swollen tonsils, maybe with those white spots, swollen lymph nodes, fever, the whole works.
And your sources mention that it produces this exotoxin, causing beta hemolysis on blood agar.
Which means it basically destroys red blood cells.
Right. And that's a key feature used for lab diagnosis.
But the bigger worry with strep is what can happen if it's not treated.
Oh, definitely. It can lead to some serious complications.
Like scarlet fever.
Yeah, with that distinctive rash caused by these streptococcal pyrogenic exotoxins, which are superantigens.
Superantigens, meaning they kind of send the immune system into overdrive, right?
Exactly, an exaggerated response,
Right.
leading to more widespread inflammation.
And then there's rheumatic fever, an autoimmune condition where the body attacks its own tissues.
Heart, joints, kidneys, it can be really debilitating.
And acute glomerulonephritis, a kidney problem, and even streptococcal toxic shock syndrome.
Which is very serious, potentially fatal.
It's almost scary how one little bacteria can cause so much trouble.
It is, but the good news is that antibiotics are usually very effective against strep.
So rapid diagnosis is key, using those quick antigen tests or throat cultures.
Exactly. Catch it early, treat it, and you drastically reduce the risk of those complications.
Okay, next on the list, Streptococcus pneumonia, another strep.
Similar name, but causing different problems.
This one's a big culprit for those invasive lung infections, often as a secondary infection.
Right. And what makes some strains really dangerous is their capsule.
It's like a shield, right? Protecting them from the immune system.
Prevents those phagocytes from engulfing and destroying them.
But it also triggers this intense inflammatory response, which is what leads to the pneumonia.
Exactly. Fluid buildup, immune cells flooding the lungs. It's a nasty situation.
And it can spread, right?
It can, leading to bacteremia, bacteria in the bloodstream, infecting other parts of the body.
Bones, the middle ear, even heart valves.
Yeah, it's often involved in those elderly patients who die from what's listed as respiratory failure.
So it's a sneaky one.
It is, but we do have vaccines that can help.
There's the one with 23 different capsular polysaccharides for adults and Prevnar 13 for those over 50.
Which covers the most dangerous strains.
But there's growing resistance to some antibiotics.
There is. Penicillin, erythromycin, cefotaxime, they're not always effective anymore.
Which is worrying.
It is, but thankfully vancomycin still seems to work against those resistant strains.
Okay, let's move on to something a little different, diphtheria.
Corynebacterium diphtheria, blast from the past.
I remember learning about this in school. Wasn't it a major killer back in the day?
It was, particularly for young children, and still can be in areas where vaccination rates are low.
It spreads through the air, right?
It does, infecting the throat and tonsils, causing that characteristic swelling of the neck.
Almost like a bullfrog.
And a hallmark of diphtheria is the formation of this pseudomembrane in the throat.
Which is basically a layer of dead cells and bacteria. Sounds awful.
It can make breathing very difficult. And only the pathogenic strains carry the diphtheria toxin.
That's the real problem, right? It shuts down protein synthesis in cells.
Exactly, leading to all sorts of tissue damage.
Diagnosis usually involves throat swabs, culturing it on special media.
But prevention is key here. The toxoid vaccine is very effective.
Part of the DTaP3 series, right?
Exactly. And if someone does get infected, antibiotics are used, penicillin, erythromycin, gentamicin.
And in severe cases, they use diphtheria antitoxin.
To neutralize the toxin that's already circulating in the body.
Okay, next up, pertussis, aka whooping cough.
Another one that mostly affects kids, but can be nasty for adults too.
That cough is unmistakable.
It is. Those violent coughing fits followed by that whooping sound as they try to breathe in.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. It can go on for weeks. And Bordetella pertussis, the bacteria responsible, it attaches to those ciliated cells in the airways.
And releases pertussis toxin.
Right, which messes with cell signaling, leading to all that coughing.
And it's endemic worldwide, your sources say.
Meaning it's always circulating. But vaccination has made a huge difference.
The DTaP3 again, right?
It is. Dramatically reduced the number of cases.
But there are still outbreaks, even in well-vaccinated populations.
There are. And treatment usually involves antibiotics, ampicillin, tetracycline, erythromycin.
But your sources mention that they might not always fully cure the infection?
It seems the immune system plays a big role in actually clearing the bacteria.
Okay, on to a really big one, tuberculosis.
Mycobacterium tuberculosis, still a major killer globally.
Your sources say 1.5 million deaths a year. That's a staggering number.
It is, and what's so challenging about TB is how tough this bacterium is.
It's acid fast, right? Because of those waxy mycolic acids in the cell wall.
Exactly. It's resistant to drying out, to disinfectants, even to some of our immune defenses.
And that acid-fast property is how they identify it in the lab.
Right, using that Seal-Nielsen stain.
It spreads through the air, so it's easily transmitted.
It is, especially in crowded conditions, and primary infection is usually in the lungs.
Leading to those tubercles.
Which are basically clumps of macrophages trying to contain the infection.
And the bacteria can often be found in the sputum, that coughed up stuff.
Which can then spread the infection to others.
And TB can be tricky because sometimes it's asymptomatic.
That's latent TB. They'll test positive on a skin test, but they don't have active disease.
But it can reactivate later?
It can, years later even. And then there's post-primary TB, which is reinfection.
And treating TB is a long haul.
It is months of multiple antibiotics, like isoniazid, which targets mycolic acid synthesis, and rifampin.
Multiple drugs are crucial to prevent resistance.
Absolutely. And multi-drug resistant TB, or MDR-TB, that's a huge problem.
Makes treatment even harder with those second-line drugs that have more side effects.
It's a major reason why TB remains such a global health challenge.
Okay, let's talk about a relative of TB, Mycobacterium leprae, which causes leprosy.
Another acid-fast bacterium, but leprosy is quite different from TB.
Your sources talk about two main forms, lepromatous leprosy, which is more severe,
With those widespread skin lesions filled with bacteria
and tuberculoid leprosy, which is milder.
and associated with a stronger immune response.
Transmission seems to be through direct contact, but maybe airborne too.
Less contagious than TB, though, and it's linked to poverty, malnutrition, poor sanitation.
They usually diagnose it by looking for those acid-fast bacteria in skin lesions.
But there's a blood test now, too, which can catch it earlier.
And treatment is multi-drug therapy, dapsone, rifampin, clofazimine.
Often for extended periods.
Okay, last one on the airborne bacteria list, meningitis, caused by Neisseria meningitis.
Oh, that's a scary one. Inflammation of the meninges, those membranes around the brain and spinal cord.
And it can progress really fast.
It can. And meningitis or meningococcus, it's a gram-negative bacterium.
Spread through the air, colonizes the nasopharynx, and then can invade the bloodstream.
Causing bacteremia, and the symptoms, they hit hard and fast. Headache, vomiting, stiff neck.
And it can lead to coma and death quickly,
It can, especially in that fulminant form.
which is basically widespread blood clotting, tissue destruction, shock. Terrifying.
It is, and it often occurs in outbreaks, close living situations.
Diagnosis involves culturing from nasopharyngeal swabs, blood, or cerebrospinal fluid.
And treatment is usually intravenous penicillin, started even before they get the lab results back.
Because it's so aggressive.
It is, and there are vaccines that can protect against the most common strains.
And rifampin is used for close contacts to prevent spread.
And what's interesting is that lots of people carry meningococcus without symptoms.
So it's like a ticking time bomb.
In a way, yeah, you never know when it might strike.
Okay, deep breath. Let's switch gears and talk about airborne viral diseases.
Now, viruses, they're a whole different beast.
Your sources say they're incredibly contagious, and they can hang out in those tiny airborne droplets.
They can, and the problem with viruses is that to kill them, you often have to kill the host cells they've infected.
Which makes treatment tricky.
It does. We have fewer antiviral drugs compared to antibiotics.
So we often rely on the body's own immune system to fight them off.
Right, and sometimes that's enough, but not always.
Okay, first up, measles, or rubeola, sometimes called 7-day measles.
Caused by paramyxovirus, an RNA virus.
Spread through the air, affects the whole body.
And the symptoms, they're pretty classic: runny nose, red, watery eyes, fever, cough, and then that rash.
That measles rash all over the body.
And while most people recover just fine, thanks to their immune system,
It can cause complications.
it can, middle ear infections, pneumonia, and rarely encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain.
And your sources talk about how vaccination has been a game changer for measles.
It has. The vaccine came out in 1963, and it drastically reduced the number of cases.
But there's been a recent uptick in cases and deaths globally.
There has, and it seems to be linked to those drops in vaccination rates during the COVID pandemic.
A reminder that we can't let our guard down, even for diseases we thought we had under control.
Exactly. Vaccination is crucial.
Okay, next, rubella, or German measles, also called 3-day measles.
Another RNA virus, but generally milder than measles.
And less contagious.
It is. And the symptoms are often less severe, sometimes just a rash on the upper body,
But the big concern with rubella is if a pregnant woman gets infected,
especially during the first trimester,
it can cause congenital rubella syndrome in the baby.
which can lead to all sorts of serious birth defects: stillbirth, deafness, heart defects, eye problems, brain damage.
It's heartbreaking.
It is, which is why the MMR vaccine is so important.
Measles, mumps, and rubella all in one shot.
And it's been very successful. The Americas have been declared rubella-free.
That's amazing, a testament to the power of vaccination.
It is, and hopefully one day we can eradicate rubella globally.
Okay, on to mumps, another highly contagious airborne disease.
Caused by a paramyxovirus,
And the hallmark of mumps is that swelling of the salivary glands,
especially the parotid glands, those ones in front of the ears.
giving you that chipmunk look.
It can, and the virus can spread to other organs, the testes, the pancreas.
And in rare cases, encephalitis.
But most people recover just fine and have lifelong immunity afterwards.
And the MMR vaccine protects against mumps too.
It does, and it's very effective.
Yeah.
But we do see outbreaks even in vaccinated populations.
Usually among young adults, right?
Right, so there are catch-up vaccination recommendations for that age group.
Okay, next, chickenpox.
Bordetella zoster virus, or VZV, a DNA virus this time.
And it's super contagious.
It is. spread through the air and through contact with those blisters.
Or even contaminated objects.
It's one you usually get as a kid, a mild but very itchy disease.
With that classic rash.
Papules, vesicles, pustules, crusts, the whole shebang.
And it usually heals without scarring, but the virus can stick around.
It can, lying dormant in nerve cells.
And reactivate later as shingles.
Which is much less fun. A painful rash, often in older adults or people with weakened immune systems.
And thankfully, there are vaccines for shingles now.
There are Zostavax and Shingrix, which are highly effective.
Okay, on to the bane of our existence, the common cold.
Ah, yes, the common cold, caused by a whole bunch of different viruses.
Mostly rhinoviruses, but also adenoviruses, coronaviruses.
Spread through droplets, contact, you name it.
And those symptoms, we all know them: runny nose, congestion, sneezing, aches, that blah feeling.
But usually no fever with a cold.
And antiviral drugs don't really work for colds?
No, they don't. It's mostly about treating the symptoms, easing the misery.
And there are so many different cold viruses, we can get them over and over again.
We can. No lasting immunity, unfortunately.
Okay, last one in this category, influenza.
The flu. Highly contagious, a real heavy hitter.
Another RNA virus, this one with a segmented genome.
And influenza A is the main culprit for humans.
And they're classified by those HA and NA proteins on the surface, like H1N1.
Exactly. Hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. Those are key for how the virus infects cells.
And the flu is constantly changing, right?
It is. That's where antigenic drift comes in. Small mutations in the HA and NA genes.
Which is why we need a new flu vaccine every year.
To match the circulating strains.
And then there's antigenic shift, which is much more dramatic.
That's when two different flu viruses infect the same cell and swap genes.
Creating a whole new virus.
It can lead to pandemics.
Like the Spanish flu, the Asian flu, the swine flu.
Those were devastating.
Flu symptoms can be pretty rough. Fever, chills, fatigue, aches, cough, sore throat.
And the risk of secondary bacterial infections, like pneumonia, is serious.
Especially for those with weakened immune systems.
The annual flu vaccine is the best way to protect yourself.
And antiviral drugs can help if taken early.
Like Tamiflu, a neuraminidase inhibitor.
And thankfully, pandemics are less frequent than seasonal outbreaks.
Yeah, usually every 10 to 40 years.
Okay, let's move on to diseases spread by direct contact, not sexual contact.
So touching, sharing objects, that kind of thing.
And first up, Staphylococcus aureus. This one seems to be everywhere.
It is a gram-positive bacterium, often found on our skin and in our noses.
Part of our normal flora, but it can turn nasty.
It can, causing skin infections, wound infections, pneumonia.
And a whole bunch of other things. Acne, boils, impetigo, bone infections, even meningitis.
It's a versatile little bugger.
And many staph infections are pyogenic.
Pus-forming, yeah, not pretty.
Your sources mention several virulence factors, like hemolysins, coagulase, leukocidin.
All helping it to cause damage and evade the immune system.
And then there's toxic shock syndrome, or TSS.
Caused by a superantigen toxin can be very serious.
They diagnose staph infections by culturing on mannitol salt agar.
A special medium that selects for staph and differentiates between types.
And they can use PCR to detect specific genes.
And there are rapid tests for MRSA.
Methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, a big problem.
Huge problem. Resistant to many antibiotics, a real challenge to treat.
And there are different types. Hospital-acquired MRSA and community-acquired MRSA.
They have different resistance patterns.
And treating MRSA often requires different antibiotics, like clindamycin or tetracyclines.
And preventing staph infections is all about good hygiene, washing hands, covering wounds.
Okay, next up, Helicobacter pylori and its link to stomach problems.
This one's interesting. It actually lives in the stomach.
In that super acidic environment.
It does. It's a gram-negative bacterium, spiral-shaped.
And it's found all over the world.
Very common, especially in developing countries.
And it's linked to gastritis, ulcers, even stomach cancer.
It is. It produces urese, which neutralizes stomach acid, allowing it to survive.
And it has other virulence factors, too.
Toxins, components of its LPS, all causing inflammation and damage.
They can diagnose it through a biopsy or a breath test.
The breath test looks for urese activity.
And treatment usually involves multiple antibiotics, plus an antacid.
To help heal the stomach lining.
And your sources really emphasize that link between H. pylori and stomach cancer.
It's a significant risk factor.
Okay, on to hepatitis, which is inflammation of the liver.
It can be caused by several different viruses, A, D, C, D, and E.
Hep A and E are usually spread through food and water.
But Hep B and C are more relevant to our direct contact discussion.
Right. Hep B is a DNA virus, also called serum hepatitis.
And it's spread through blood, needles, Mother-to-child transmission, sexual contact.
It can cause acute illness, chronic infection, and even liver cancer,
And thankfully, we have a vaccine for Hep B.
which has made a huge difference.
It has greatly reduced the incidence of infection.
And then there's Hep D, which is a bit unusual.
It's a defective virus. It needs Hep B to replicate.
So the Hep B vaccine protects against Hep D indirectly.
It does.
And then there's Hep C, an RNA virus.
Spread through blood, usually needles.
Often mild initially, but can lead to chronic hepatitis, cirrhosis, and liver cancer.
And no vaccine for Hep C, unfortunately.
But there are new antiviral drugs that are very effective.
They are often curative, which is great news.
Symptoms of hepatitis can include fever, jaundice, liver enlargement.
And diagnosis usually involves blood tests, looking for liver enzymes and viral markers.
And prevention is key. Vaccines for Hep A and B, safe injection practices, universal precautions.
And treatment depends on the specific virus.
Okay, last one in this section, Ebola virus.
Oh, that's a nasty one. Highly contagious and often deadly.
It's a filovirus, an RNA virus with a filamentous shape.
And it spreads through contact with bodily fluids, broken skin, mucous membrane.
And even contaminated objects.
And the natural reservoir is still unknown, but bats are suspected.
The symptoms are brutal: fever, fatigue, diarrhea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and sometimes bleeding.
Internal and external bleeding.
It can cause liver damage, disrupt blood clotting, trigger a massive inflammatory response,
Leading to multi-organ failure.
and the mortality rate is really high.
35 to 70%, depending on the outbreak.
There's no specific treatment, just supportive care.
Fluids, electrolytes, oxygen, managing symptoms.
But survivors do develop antibodies.
They do, providing some immunity.
And there are experimental vaccines that show promise.
Hopefully, they'll prove effective.
Okay, deep breath again. Let's move on to sexually transmitted infections, or STIs.
A whole other category of pathogens, bacteria, viruses, protists, fungi.
All spread through sexual contact.
And STIs has some common features: latency, persistence, recurrence,
And many are asymptomatic, meaning no symptoms.
which makes them even harder to control.
Most bacterial STIs are treatable with antibiotics.
And one viral STI, HPV, is preventable by vaccine.
And condoms are crucial for preventing spread.
Absolutely, barrier protection is key.
But untreated STIs can lead to serious long-term complications.
Infertility, chronic pain, even cancer.
And there's been a recent increase in the incidence of several STIs.
Which is concerning, a sign that we need to step up prevention efforts.
Okay, first up, gonorrhea.
Caused by Neisseria gonorrhea, a gram-negative bacterium.
Very sensitive to drying out, sunlight, UV light.
Spread through sexual contact.
And symptoms can vary between men and women.
In women, it's often asymptomatic or mild,
But it can lead to pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID.
which can cause infertility.
In men, it usually causes urethritis.
Painful urination, pus discharge,
And untreated gonorrhea can damage heart valves, joints.
and cause eye infections in newborns.
Treatment is usually with antibiotics, Cefixime, ceftriaxone, often with azithromycin or doxycycline.
Because resistance to penicillin and quinolones is common.
And gonorrhea is so prevalent because it's often silent in women,
And there's no lasting immunity. Plus, the bacteria can change their antigens.
making reinfection possible.
Okay, next, syphilis.
Treponema pallidum, a spirochete bacterium,
Sensitive to environmental stress,
spread through sexual contact or from mother to fetus.
causing congenital syphilis.
And syphilis goes through stages,
Primary syphilis with that chancre, a painless sore.
which heals on its own.
But then comes secondary syphilis, a rash all over the body.
And it can affect mucous membranes, eyes, joints, even the CNS
And if still untreated, it can progress to tertiary syphilis,
years later.
causing all sorts of damage: skin, bones, heart, brain.
Diagnosis involves microscopy of the chancre or blood tests.
Serological tests, looking for antibodies against the bacteria.
And treatment is usually with penicillin.
Still very effective.
But syphilis rates are rising, possibly linked to better HIV treatment.
People feeling safer, maybe taking more risks.
And there's a related disease, yaws,
Caused by a different subspecies of Treponema pallidum,
spread through skin contact, not sexual contact.
causing ulcerous lesions.
And treated with penicillin or azithromycin.
Okay, next up, chlamydia,
Chlamydia trachomatis, an intracellular bacterium.
meaning it lives inside our cells.
And it's the most common bacterial STI globally.
Often asymptomatic, especially in women.
It can cause non-gonococcal urethritis or NGU.
In both men and women.
And in men, it can cause testicular swelling, prostatitis.
In women, it can lead to cervicitis, PID, fallopian tube damage, infertility, ectopic pregnancy, chronic pelvic
A
pain.
whole laundry list of problems.
And it can be transmitted to newborns during birth, causing eye infections and pneumonia.
They usually diagnose it with nucleic acid tests or immunological tests.
And treatment is with antibiotics, doxycycline, or azithromycin,
And they often treat for gonorrhea at the same time.
because co-infection is common.
And there's a more severe form, lymphogranuloma venereum or LGV,
Caused by specific strains of Chlamydia trachomatis.
causing swollen lymph nodes in the groin, proctitis.
Okay, onto the viral STIs, starting with herpes simplex virus, or HSV.
There are two main types, HSV1 and HSV2.
Both are DNA viruses, and they cause lifelong infections.
HSV1 is usually oral herpes, cold sores.
Spread through contact with lesions or saliva,
It lies dormant in nerve cells and reactivates periodically.
causing those recurrent outbreaks.
HSV2 is usually genital herpes.
Spread through sexual contact.
Also lies dormant in nerve cells, causing recurrent outbreaks of painful blisters.
It can be transmitted even when there are no symptoms,
And genital herpes in a pregnant woman can be dangerous for the baby,
causing brain damage or even death.
so they often do a C-section in those cases.
And there's a possible link between HSV2 and cervical cancer,
There's no cure for herpes, but antiviral drugs can help manage outbreaks.
like acyclovir, valacyclovir. They can reduce symptoms and speed healing.
Okay, last one. Human papillomavirus, or HPV.
A whole family of DNA viruses, over 100 types.
And about 40 of them are sexually transmitted.
Some cause genital warts,
But some are high-risk types, linked to cancer.
especially cervical cancer.
About 14 types are considered oncogenic.
And types 16 and 18 cause the majority of cervical cancers.
Most HPV infections are asymptomatic and go away on their own,
But persistent infection with high-risk types can lead to precancerous lesions.
which can progress to cancer if not treated. And thankfully, we have HPV vaccines now,
Like Gardasil, which protects against the most dangerous types.
including those that cause cervical cancer and genital warts.
And vaccination is recommended for both males and females
Ideally, before they become sexually active.
to provide the best protection.
Wow, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from those airborne invaders to those spread by touch and through intimate contact.
Bacteria, viruses, it's a whole microbial world out there.
And it's clear that these pathogens are constantly evolving, finding new ways to spread and survive.
They are. And the interconnectedness of our world makes it easier for them to travel.
Which makes prevention and control even more challenging.
It does. It's an ongoing battle.
So, given all this, what do you think are the biggest challenges we face in preventing infectious diseases going forward?
I think vaccine hesitancy is a big one. People choosing not to vaccinate themselves or their kids.
And antibiotic resistance is a growing crisis.
It is. Bacteria evolving to become resistant to the drugs we use to treat them.
Global travel makes it easier for diseases to spread rapidly.
And we're always at risk of new infectious diseases emerging.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But understanding how these diseases work, how they spread, and how to prevent them, that's the first step.
And hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners the knowledge they need to navigate this complex world.
I hope so.
And on that note, I think we've thoroughly covered the key information from Chapter 31 on person-to-person bacterial and viral diseases.
I agree. We've touched on all the major points.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay healthy out there.
And informed.